Hi there, thank you so much for joining me today. This video is going to be an update to a video I've done a few times over the years where I talk about how many times I've reached for each of my eyeshadow palettes. Some of my palettes are a few years old in my collection, so I do have a number of uses and how they've changed over the years, and I do even have one eyeshadow palette that I've owned the entirety of the span of the 4 videos that I've done. So I did my first ever video like this back in May of 2020, and then I did it again about 2 years later in August of 2022. I did it another year after that in September of 2023, and I'm now doing it in December of 2024. I'm gonna start with my least used eyeshadow palettes and work my way all the way up to the most used. And like I have in my previous videos, I am gonna put a list of all the eyeshadow palettes that I own, and I'd love for you to guess in the comments which one you think is my most used palette and which one is my least used. And I quickly wanted to mention that earlier this year I did an unofficial No Pan Left Behind challenge to myself, and I made an effort to reach for every single eyeshadow in all of my palettes, and I reached for each palette 12 times. So the minimum amount of uses for each of these palettes is at least 12 more uses than in my last update, with the exception of one, which is an eyeshadow palette that I actually got as a Christmas present from my brother and sister-in-law. It was so nice of them to give this to me. This is the Natasha Denona I Need a Nude palette. I only just received this as a gift a few days ago, and so I have not reached for it a ton. I'm actually wearing it on my eyes for the first time today, and this Mia shade here in the corner is such a stunning, sparkly lid topper. And so this is my least used eyeshadow palette in my collection because it's brand new. The next one is also a very, very new eyeshadow palette to me. It's from Lethal Cosmetics. It's the Avatar The Last Airbender palette, and I got the Earth version. These are very saturated mattes, and so they really pop. And I really have to use a light hand for these, but I have really enjoyed this palette so far, and I have worn this 12 times. Again, with this being one of my newest palettes, I'm not surprised that I've only worn it 12 times. I am really surprised about this next one because I'm pretty sure I mentioned it in my last update too. This is one of my favorite palettes, the Hude Beauty Rose Quartz palette. I don't think they make this anymore, unfortunately. Total, I've worn this eyeshadow palette 61 times, but I've only worn it an additional 12 times since my last update, which was September of 2023. Still a favorite, even if I didn't reach for it that much this year. I have uses for this palette from past updates too, and so in August of 2022 I had worn this a total of 43 times. A year later I had only worn it 6 more times, so 49 uses, and now it's at 61. The next one is the What's Up Beauty Geodes palette. This was new to my collection in my last update, and so in September of 2023 I had only worn it 8 times. I did say that I really liked this palette, and I still really do like this palette. This color story is very me. And since that last update, I've worn it 13 more times for a total of 21 uses. Next up is a very new palette. I either received it at the very end of last year or the very beginning of this year in PR, and that's the Dragon palette from What's Up Beauty. This is a beautiful, beautiful eyeshadow palette. I love these sparkly shades, these multi-chromes. That being said, I have worn this 13 times since receiving it. And if you are looking for eyeshadow content from me, I don't really have a lot. I don't focus on eyeshadow palettes in my content that I make, but I do have a 3 looks 1 palette with the Rose Quartz palette from Hude Beauty. In one of my vlogs, I did a couple of looks with this Avatar palette, and I did a video earlier this year about my favorite unlikely eyeshadow palette pairings, and I showed you palettes that I think go really well together, even though they're a little unexpected, and I do show looks that I create with those combinations in that video. And if I can think of videos that I've created with these palettes, I will mention that as I go. Next up is Shroud Arcana. I've had this for a few years, so I have numbers from the past. In August of 2022, I had worn this 3 times. I had mentioned that I really liked it, but this color story is a little deeper than I typically go, and I wanted to make an effort to reach for it more, and I was able to do that for my next update. A year later, I had reached for it 31 times total. It gave me a really good feel for the formula of each of these, and I still think this is a really beautiful color story. I don't think Shroud Cosmetics exists anymore. I'm not sure. I haven't really seen much from that brand. And since my last update, I've reached for it an additional 13 times for a total of 44 uses. Next up is a palette that I love. I did do a video dedicated to my Lethal's single palette. This is a custom palette that I made myself. I have pan on 2 shades, this one Retrograde and then Series up here. And these pans I would say are relatively thin. I think it wouldn't be that difficult to hit pan on shades, but they are larger in size. So it's one thing to hit pan on the shade and then a completely different thing to actually try to finish a shade. In 2022, I had reached for it 13 times. A year later, I had reached for it 25 more times for a total of 38 uses. And I'm now at 51 uses, meaning I used it an additional 13 times. This next palette is the one that I've had for several years at this point. It's one of my oldest palettes, and so I have numbers for every update that I've done since May of 2020. In that first video, I had used the Juicy Olive palette by Give Me Glow 4 times. I had mentioned that I wanted to try and reach for it more for my next update, and I did. So in 2022, 2 years later, it had bumped up to 22 uses. The next year, I was able to bump it up even more to 35 uses, and now I have used this 48 times for an additional 13 uses since my last update. Next up is the Geologie Cosmetics Pilbara palette. In my very first update with this palette in 2022, I had only worn it 5 times. It was a relatively new eyeshadow palette to me. And then the next year I had bumped it up to 18 uses. I've now reached for this 31 uses. And even though I really love this sparkly green eyeshadow here called Starry Sky, the rest of the shimmer shades have dramatically gone down in quality. I do think I'm going to declutter this eyeshadow palette. Next up is the Sydney Grace Enduring Love palette. In my first update with this palette in 2022, I had worn this 20 times. I bumped that up to 69 times in my next update a year later in September 2023. The main reason for that is because I had red hair for the majority of the time between those 2 updates. And so I was wearing this pink shadow Darcy as an eyeshadow or as an eyebrow powder. Even though it's really pink in the pan, when I added it to my eyebrows, it added enough of a red tint to match the rest of my hair, and I really liked it for that. But I also reached for the other shades in the palette too. Since last year, I've worn this an additional 14 times for a total of 83 uses. Next up is Shroud Cosmetics It's Freakin' Bats palette. Mine looks a little bit different because I hit pan on this shade Dairy, which was originally a really dark cool tone purple plum color. And after I hit pan, the formula was really fragile and it ended up falling out and getting everywhere. So I just put a different eyeshadow in there. This is a Colourpop single from a miscellaneous palette from forever ago. I do miss having a darker purple color in there, but that's okay, accidents happen. In my first update with this palette in August of 2022, I had only worn it 5 times. I had mentioned that I was a little intimidated by this color story. I don't really wear these sorts of shades all the time, and I wanted to make a bigger effort to reach for it more, and I did. In the next update, I had worn it 53 times, so almost 50 times more in a year. And now another year later, I'm up to 67 uses, which means I reached for it 14 more times. Retro Glam by Natasha Denona is also a new palette for me. I think I purchased it earlier this year. I used Ulta points, I'm pretty sure. And I just really wanted to get these greens and pinks. I think this is a beautiful palette, and I don't have any updates from past years because, like I said, it's brand new, and I've reached for this 15 times since getting it. Next up is Limoncello by Colourpop. It's really the only very warm eyeshadow palette that I have. Maybe the Too Faced Natural Nudes would be considered a warm palette too, but this one is like an orangey warm, while Natural Nudes is more of a pink warm. The packaging is stunning. It's really the main reason why I purchased the palette to begin with, but these colors are really pretty, and I do have pan in this top shade, Tuscan Fun. In 2022, I had worn it 32 times. The next year, my number of uses bumped up to 68 times, and I have now reached for this 84 times, for an additional 16 more uses since my last update. Next up is Desert Monsoon by What's Up Beauty. This was one of the first things from What's Up that I received. Since getting the Dragon palette, I would say the Dragon palette is my favorite What's Up Beauty palette, but this is number 2 and it was number 1 for the longest time. I just love these colors so much. I bring this traveling with me a lot because these are really compact and feel very sturdy. This glow color is the perfect champagne shade to just throw on when I don't want to do much else. I really like these brown mattes. I think they make it really easy to create something simple. Humidity, this shade right here, is the perfect light cool tone pink color. Love the greens, the purples, even this blue. I wouldn't say I wear it all the time, but I still think it looks really, really beautiful. And I got 28 uses out of it in my last update, September 2023, and now a year later I'm up to 46 uses, meaning I've worn it an additional 18 times. This next one is a newer palette. I think I got it last year or maybe the year before. It's a quad from LH Cosmetics, the Shimmer Saga. It's 4 really sparkly, shimmery multi-chrome shades. And I really like this palette. These types of shades are right up my alley. If I'm doing something and it looks a little too boring and I want to take it up a notch, I can just pat one of these on top, or I can just wear it on its own with nothing else. I love it. I've been considering getting the other quad from the brand, but I don't know if I would wear those shades as often as I wear these. Last year I had worn it 18 times. This time around I've worn it 36 total times, meaning I wore it an additional 18 times since my last update. So this palette is technically new, but it's not at the same time. This is the Colourpop Flutterby palette, but I did a video where I went through all of my eyeshadow palettes that had pans this size, and I took them all out and I only kept the ones that I really, really wanted to keep, and then I decluttered the rest to my friend. I find myself reaching for this palette a lot more than my other Colourpop palettes when I had them separately, because this has like all of my favorite shades in one place. And so total, I've reached for this palette 22 times. The individual shades from other palettes I've probably reached for more, but I didn't track each shade individually like that to give you those sorts of numbers. So I've worn this at least 22 times. The next one is another new eyeshadow palette. I think I bought this right at the very end of 2023. It's from the brand Vieve, and this is the Ninetease palette. This is a gray cool tone lover's dream. I love this palette. I love how light and truly cool tone these colors are. I think it's a great alternative to the next palette I'm going to talk about, which is the Too Faced Natural Nudes palette. I really love the mattes from this palette, and sometimes I'm not looking for something really warm. Sometimes I want that gradient of different shades, but I want them to be truly cool toned. If you'd like a more thorough review of this palette, I do have a full face of Vieve video, and I've reached for this 23 times since buying it. Sorry, I did spoil this one. My number one, and I feel like it was my number one last year too, is the Too Faced Natural Nudes palette. Total, I've worn this eyeshadow palette 219 times. It's my most used eyeshadow palette in my collection by far. I've panned on a couple shades. I did have this in some Pan Those Eyeshadows projects back in the day. In August of 2022, I had worn it 121 times. I had only reached for it 7 more times a year later, so I was up to 128. And now I am up to 219 uses, meaning I've worn it an additional 91 times since my last update in September of last year. I love this palette. If this were to expire on me, I would very likely repurchase it. I think it's just a really great staple eyeshadow palette for me. I use it to build a lot of other looks. I've said in the past that the shimmer shades aren't really my favorite, but I think I'm gonna try to use some of these as nail polish to see if that works. I do that sometimes with like my really sparkly single eyeshadows, and if I can get use out of these in a different way, in a way that I still really enjoy, I think that would be great. Just to give some perspective, my most used eyeshadow palette in my collection is Natural Nudes at 219, and then my second most used eyeshadow palette is an almost tie between Limoncello and Sydney Grace Enduring Love. Limoncello I've worn 84 times and Sydney Grace I've worn 83 times. So that's interesting. I'd never really looked at it like that, but yeah, my number one is over 200 uses and then number 2 and 3 are under 100 uses. That's a pretty big gap. I would love to know if your guesses were right. I feel like my eyeshadow usage is relatively predictable, and I definitely plan on doing this at least with my blushes soon too. I don't know how well this would apply to other categories in my collection, like highlighters and bronzers and lip products, but I'll look at the numbers and see if there is anything worth sharing. It is fun to go back and redo an update of this every year or so just to see how things have changed. Anyway, that's everything I have for today. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!